I'm Bob Hazel. I'm with the North Carolina chapter of the Wildlife Society. Today is February 14, 2003, and we are in Zebulon, North Carolina for an interview which is part of our program that we call Celebrating Our Wildlife Conservation Heritage. The purpose of this program is to document the history of the wildlife profession by talking with people who helped build it and hear it from the people that made it happen. And we have one of those people with us today who we're going to feature in this interview, and he is Dr. Eugene Hester, a wildlife biologist with a distinguished career that includes service with a number of organizations in Washington and even in retirement. Gene is very active, and he will tell us something about that. And also with us today is Dr. Tom Quay, who I think was quite instrumental in Gene's choosing a wildlife profession for his career, and who will share in telling some of Gene's stories. Gene, we want to hear from you the story of your career in wildlife management as you want to tell it. You might want to begin by telling us something about your background, your family, how you got interested in wildlife conservation, and just take it from there. So tell us your story.
Great, Bob. I appreciate the opportunity to get with you and talk about these kind of things. I grew up here in Wendell, only 4 miles from where we are now. My father was a country doctor, and back in those days he actually made house calls out in the country. He was a hunter and a fisherman, outdoorsman in a lot of ways, and so were my brothers, and through them I got introduced into hunting and fishing and the outdoors in general. In fact, with my dad, I would oftentimes go with him not only on hunting and fishing trips, but even when he made those house calls, we would do a little bird count. We'd look for birds on wires and trees and flying across the road and so forth as we would go along. And we wouldn't get a point unless you could correctly identify the bird. And so we'd keep a little score going out and coming back. And so through that I learned a lot about birds and where they lived and why they flocked and what they ate and stuff like that. Later on, even while I was in high school, hunting was pretty dear to me, and fishing, and even trapping a few muskrats and things like that. And I remember I would oftentimes leave school, run home, get the bird dog, change clothes right quick, grab a shotgun, and head out across the country. And my dad would pick me up at our farm about 3 miles outside of town at dark, and once in a while I'd get a couple of quail or a rabbit or something like that, and they were great times. So I grew up with that kind of a background, and when it was time to go to college, my family encouraged me to go to college, and I went to Wake Forest to study liberal arts because frankly I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so my father being a medical doctor, uncle for whom I was named was an attorney, I figured maybe one of those. So for about a couple of years I was taking a very general liberal arts kind of background, and candidly was floundering. A couple of times I even wondered whether I was going to make the grade for that semester. And after 2 years of it, my older brother Mac said, I think you really are destined for something in forestry. And so let's go to NC State and find out about the forestry program. When we got there, I found out there was such a thing called wildlife conservation and management. And I said, stop right there. I've got to find out about that before we go any further. So I found out it was over in the zoology department. Went over there and started talking to some people. And I found out about the kinds of courses they had and the kinds of field trips they had. And I said, this is for me. So I transferred into it. And as I've said, I didn't die and go to heaven. I lived and went to heaven. And so in a lot of ways, I really found a home in wildlife conservation and management. That, if I'd known about it earlier, I'd probably been there earlier, but I didn't know about such a thing. And so my whole outlook on college and career and everything changed at that point. And so over there I took the courses in zoology and botany and ecology and wildlife and fisheries and so forth. And in the process of doing so, I took Dr. Quay's ornithology class and some other of his classes too. But in the ornithology class, I was able to relate things that my father and I had done about the wood ducks coming to roost in our farm pond, and the fact that my dad and I had stood on the bank and counted the ducks and found more of them coming in October during what subsequently learned was the migration. And so I was able to build this into the coursework, and along the lines, a couple of humorous things happened. He asked us each to choose a species and do a study. I chose the wood duck, of course, and learned from him that wood ducks nested in hollow trees. That blew my mind. I knew about ducks and geese and swans nesting in marshes and under bushes and all this stuff, but hollow trees, that was a new one on me. And so I started putting up boxes and hollow logs and things and getting wood ducks to nest in them, and that began my study. But along the way, one of my classmates, a guy named Jim Airy, chose the mockingbird. And when he was down looking for those mockingbird nests across campus and in Pullen Park, one afternoon in a humorous way, he came to the library and he was parting the bushes to look for the nests, and he parted the bushes, and there was a grounds and maintenance guy standing there with his pickup stick hiding behind the bush. He said, "How long is it till 5 o'clock?" But anyway, I enjoyed every day of my time there at NC State. Worked a couple of summers for the Wildlife Commission doing fish and water quality surveys up in the western part of the state with Don Baker and Frank Richardson, and did this under Dwayne Raver's overall oversight, and then worked one summer in Chassahowitzka Refuge in Florida, and one summer through an arrangement with the college and the Wildlife Commission and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and some other entities, went to Canada to study banding ducks and geese. And so I did, that was an interesting experience as well. So when I finished BS and master's degrees in wildlife conservation and management there at NC State, I felt that I had studied basically mammals and birds and those kinds of things, but not much about fisheries, because the fishery program was still new at NC State. And so I chose to go to Auburn University to study fisheries, feeling that that was the part of my career that was most lacking. And so I went there and worked on a PhD degree, and right away people began to ask, are you going to be a fishery biologist or a wildlife biologist? And so I chose to, I thought frankly in my naivete there was such a thing as a fish and wildlife biologist. That's what I wanted to be. And so it was there by naivete. But in the rest of my career, having gone both of those routes turned out to be an advantage. Almost every aspect of my subsequent career. I was briefly on the faculty at Auburn University for one semester, then had a chance to come back to NC State and be a member of the zoology department. And so I did that, and in doing so I taught everything from general zoology to vertebrate zoology to fisheries and wildlife courses, and did directed graduate programs and so forth, and became the leader of the first cooperative fishery unit there at NC State. In a sense, odd, interesting way, it was sort of like the first of the fish and wildlife units, which now exist everywhere because we still had interest in the wood ducks and had some studies going on it, and did the fishery studies as well. A lot of it was applied kind of stuff, trying to help refuges and other management entities answer questions about their populations and population dynamics and how to manage the populations better. We also did things like take students to Mattamuskeet and help with the banding programs and those kind of things. So it gave them some real field experience. Along the line, one thing I'd like to mention is I was advisor to a lot of students, both graduates and undergraduates. And one of the things I used to tell students was, go to work in the summer, or whenever you can, in your chosen profession. Go out there, go work on it. Three things will happen. One is it will make you a better student. because you will be able to relate to the things that come up as to what happened when you are in the field dealing with these things. The second thing is you will learn whether this is really what you want to do. If you don't like mosquitoes and snakes and bugs and mud and those kind of things, getting up early, find out early before you finish your career. Don't go all the way through and then say, hey, I don't like this. Go ahead and find out. And you're most likely going to find out it's something you really want to do. And the third thing is you will be known out there for what you can and will do, and your determination and your ability to see things through to completion. And these are important considerations when people look for somebody to do a job. And so I still think that was important for students to see that and to do it, and to get some of that kind of experience. And I'll mention that later when we talk about a endowment program we have there at NC State. But along about that time, I mentioned I did become the first unit leader there at NC State. I was on the faculty for 12 years, and eight of those years I was the leader of the cooperative unit. There came a time when director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, Spencer Smith, called and said, we're making some changes in Washington. I'm concerned about our research. It needs new direction, and we need to have a better understanding of what the management needs are and how research relates to that, and how research is translated into management recommendations. And I want you to come up and head up the fishery research division. I frankly didn't want to go to Washington. I got into this because I like to wear hip boots and be out in the swamps and seine ponds and do those kind of things. But here was a director of the organization saying, I need you to come and help me. And I know how corny it sounds, but like everybody out in the field, I oftentimes said, those guys up there know what they're doing. Why are they doing these kind of things? And so here was the director saying, come up here and help me. I'm trying to provide new direction. And as corny as it might sound, I felt like two things. One is, here's the director saying, come help me do it, and I have an obligation to help him, or be quiet the rest of my career. It was pretty early in my career to be quiet the next 30 years. And the second thing was, if you're ever going to Washington, it's a good idea to go when somebody knows who you are and they want you there. Just don't come in the back door kind of thing, but go when the director says, I need you to help me. So, as bad as I hated to do it, I took a deep breath and jumped off there and went to Washington. Subsequently, our two sons grew up there, married there, and with a 25-year career in Washington, when it came time to retire and move away, I couldn't move away because the rest of my family is up there. My wife, Catherine, was from right here at Wendell as well. In fact, I met her in high school and subsequently married her when I was in college. And so we wanted to be back here in the Wendell-Zebulon area, and we wanted to be up there. And so what we did was we retained our house up there and bought a smaller place in Zebulon, so we split our time between the two places. But while I was there in Washington, it was an interesting time. And after 2 years of being chief of fishery research, I had an opportunity to be head of all research, fish and wildlife research units and the whole business. And so I moved into that position, and that's the case where I think having a background in both fisheries and wildlife was an advantage, and had worked on several projects in which the hierarchy of the department was aware of some of the things we were able to accomplish, and so it made me head of all research. And an interesting assignment, and we did work very hard at trying to understand management needs and blend those with what we could learn in research and translate it into management opportunities. Along the line, with a change of administration, with our director and deputy director gone, I was asked to be acting director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Yeah, again, in my naivete, I thought it would take about a month to get a director in there. It took 10 months. 2 people came to Washington, each convinced they were going to be the new director. One was brought in by the president, and one was brought in by the Secretary of the Interior. and they had their own little tug of war as to which one was going to be director. And in the meantime, I was trying to hold an organization together, brief each of them, get them prepared for whichever one was going to become director. An interesting time in itself, because I was thrust directly into issues with the Assistant Secretary and Secretary of the Interior during a time of change. And that was when Jim Watt was there. And there were a lot of opportunities to make things happen, or to understand what was going on, or try to understand what was going on, and to translate that to the organization as to what it meant. Probably one of the greatest challenges, frankly, was, and Bob, you would understand this very well, was the morale of the organization during the time of change. In any administrative change, there's always a lot of change direction, but this one seemed to be more than most, and the troops having just lost both the director and deputy director, added to the uncertainty and the change. And there was a lot of what I think was paranoia. People began to imagine things that weren't even happening.
What's coming next? Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the biggest challenges was to be a translator of what all this meant and how to adjust to the change. So that was probably my most important assignment, was to do those things. And in the meantime, one of the things I feel very strongly about is that even though you might not agree with all the things an administration is trying to do, it's important to try to stay at the table and try to be a translator both ways, up into the political system and down into the career system, and to try to help influence things to the extent they can be influenced, or the case of misunderstandings. And so there was a good bit of that, and oftentimes in those roles, a career person such as myself gets thought of as making these changes. Frankly, it wasn't my job to make the changes. It was my job to help people understand them and to implement the changes, but not to make new policy changes. Along the way, several important things happened. Probably one of the most revealing is, I want to point out that we live and operate in a political system. A lot of people don't seem to want to recognize that. But I used to tell, and still tell, career people, nobody elected you or appointed you to charge the direction of the organization. There are people who were elected and appointed to do that, and it's your responsibility to help them carry it out, or to the extent that they don't understand something or are making a mistake, to point that out. And so that's a very fundamental thing. I like to think of it as the equivalent of a freshwater system and the ocean. The ocean's salt water, and the fresh water goes into the salt water. Somewhere, those two have to mix, and that's an estuary. The only way it's short of that is for it to fall off a cliff somewhere straight into the ocean, but even then you've got a little bit of a mixing zone. So it has to be this mixing between the career folks and the political folks, and that comes right up there, right beside the director and deputy director of the organization and the assistant secretary and the secretary, and it's inherent in the system. A lot of people don't seem to want to recognize that, but it is inherent in the system. Yeah. And so that was my job for a long period of time, was to be that interface between the career folks and the political system, and to operate both ways, and to be a translator both ways.
Let me just throw in a comment there. I like your comparison of the two coming together being an estuary. It's the way it is. And an estuary is a very productive area. And the mix between the political and the application and the thing can be the same if it's done right.
And and it changes over time. Just like during a period of drought, the salt water comes farther upstream, and during a period of heavy rains, the fresh water goes farther down. Well, the system changes the same way. Sometimes the political aspect reaches farther down, sometimes the career folks go farther up, etc. And so it bounces back and forth, and I consider that a very natural part of the system of government we have.
And you're lauding the democratic system of government.
Well, it is the democratic system of government, the political system under which we operate, and that's the way it's meant to be. Yeah. Along the line, one of the things that I have mentioned to you was the fact that oftentimes the Fish and Wildlife Service and some of its responsibilities, like the Endangered Species Act, are misunderstood. I remember the time when we were viewed as sort of like bringing the nation to its knees because of our role in the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act, that between the two of them, they were stopping progress, so to speak. And I used to mention this to Secretary Watt, that there were people and organizations using us and our authority for their own purposes, never envisioned by the Act. And he would listen to me. That's a very good trait of many political people, is that they will listen. And so he would listen, and he would even quote me, but it didn't seem to really mean very much. And I was a little frustrated that I didn't seem to be able to get that idea across. And fortunately for me, one day in the paper there, the Washington Post, there was an article about how the town of Appleton, Wisconsin, was struggling with a development going on outside of town. It was a new shopping mall outside of town, and the net effect was it was going to have severe impact on the business of downtown Appleton. The town council was sitting around one time lamenting their fate. It was an area outside of town. They couldn't zone it, they couldn't control it because it was outside of town. The developers already had an option on the land. It was going forward. And they all knew the fate of it as far as the economic influence of downtown. And so they were lamenting their fate, and the mayor said, I'll tell you what, let's go out there and start turning over rocks, and maybe we can find us an endangered species. And maybe we can get this thing stopped on the basis there's an endangered species out there. And it went even better, because it was better than I could have written. And if we don't find an endangered species, maybe we can get a little creek out there that kids jump across, declared enough navigable waters that we can bring the power of the Clean Water Act to stop it. And so I clipped that thing out, underlined some key passages in red, and sent it up to our Assistant Secretary, Ray Arnett. Monday morning we had one of these once a month management by objectives meetings, where you have certain objectives, and the question is, do you meet those objectives? And so when we started the meeting, I asked Secretary Watt if he had read that article. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. Ray Arnett, who was in the meeting, said, Jim, I have the article and it's on the way up to you, but you haven't gotten it yet. And so fortunately I had some copies there with it underlined in red, and I passed it to him in the meeting. He read it, and at that point it was like a light bulb being turned on. From that point on, instead of beating us up as he had done often, he began to defend us in the sense of when people would jump up and raise a question about an endangered species. One of my friends told me about this. I wasn't even in the meeting, but he said somebody in a large meeting jumped up and asked about some endangered species, and he said, I want to know why you asked that question. Are you really concerned about that species, or are you concerned about stopping something based on endangered species? So from my standpoint, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, staying at the table and trying to influence a decision, especially when there's a perspective that's not on the table. And so that was an important one for me, to bring that into the right kind of perspective. So there are several things that happen along those lines that are part of management, and from my standpoint, you either have to do what you can to be part of it, or if it's something you can't be part of, go lower in the organization or go to some other organization or something that better meet your needs. But I was in positions in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and later with the National Park Service as Associate Director. After I mentioned about being acting Deputy Director, I subsequently was made Deputy Director and served in that capacity for 6.5 years. Later, I went to the National Park Service as Associate Director for Natural Resources. Very similar kinds of issues and responsibilities, but a tremendous difference in the sense of the culture of the organization and the reason for being and the kinds of things in which you put your priorities as to where you budget, where you put your budget, and much more emphasis on the public and on historic buildings and those kind of things. But still a natural resource, major component about natural resources. Later, when Bruce Babbitt came there, one of his ideas was to try to separate research from management decisions. And I think it's a laudable kind of a goal, but the cards were stacked against it in the sense that we were so embroiled in the Endangered Species Act that people felt like the more that was known about some things, the more it complicated their lives. And so he tried to did pull the biological resources, research resources, from 7 different bureaus. And mostly it was Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service, but there were several others that had smaller components, and put them together in a research component that had no management responsibility. It was politically very sensitive kind of thing, and I was in the Park Service for the first 6 months of that, and at one point he asked me to come and help get that organized until he could get a director appointed and moved in there. And so I did that for about close to a year, and then remained there as deputy director of that organization until I retired about the time it was folded into the U.S. Geological Survey. I felt I had an interesting and challenging career. I felt it was the kind of thing I enjoyed doing, and certainly some days were better than others, but that goes with most any job.
Yeah, it does. It does. What sort of, not satisfaction, but recognition did you get for the work you did?
Well, first off,
You
I
pay
think,
him every month.
yeah, they paid me every month. And, and beyond that, I did move successively into some very important positions. I mean, moving to Washington to be head of research, head of fishery research, and then being moved up to be head of all research, and then being given the opportunity and responsibility to hold the organization together and move it forward, and then subsequently being appointed deputy director were important acknowledgments in themselves, in the sense that they were
recognition.
They were recognition. And I think too, when it became time to move on to somewhere else, as oftentimes happens in those kind of positions, the fact that the department felt so strongly that they wanted to keep me in some key role, they put me over in the National Park Service in a key position there about natural resources, was a recognition. And I think then the Secretary of the Interior feeling that one person who could help him get this thing moving in the direction he wanted to go was again a recognition. Along the way, I did get, I was in the senior executive service for almost 20 years at that time, since the senior executive service was first established. And those are generally recognized as the top management positions of an organization, like regional director and deputy director and so forth. And in those, there's an opportunity to be nominated for and receive a presidential rank. And I did get a presidential distinguished rank when Secretary Watt was there, and a presidential meritorious rank when Bruce Babbitt was there. And one of the reasons I point that out, but I certainly am pleased to have gotten ranked twice, but the fact that one of them was under a Republican administration and one was under a Democratic administration, I think, I personally feel that says that you can do a professional job carrying out the needs of an administration in a professional way, and so I'm pleased that it did turn out to be that way.
When you testified before Congress, did they respect your views?
Certainly it's a political body in itself, and they respected my views, but I will tell you one kind of humorous thing about that. One time when I was with National Park Service, we had a proposal there to add $10 million to national parks for several parks to do natural resource improvements. And the idea was that we chose these parks carefully. We worked up the plan very carefully as to what would be done with the money. We had a plan in place to be sure the money didn't get diverted off to other things, and that could be measured. We were going to measure what happened as a result of knowing the information and what happened to other places where we did not know the information. So I thought we had a very well thought out proposal. When it got to Congress, it began to falter. They were putting the money on other projects. So I was advised to go over and talk with the staff about what we're gonna do and to assure them about the money. So I went over to the key clerk of the appropriation committee, and I started outlining the things I just mentioned, how we chose the parks, how we came up with the money amount, how we were gonna allocate the money, how we were gonna ride herd on it to be sure the job got done. And after 20 minutes, the clerk leaned across the table and he said, "You're talking reasoning and logic. We don't deal in that. You chose projects in the wrong parks. These are not members of our committee." So, yes and no. It's sort of like, but you have to deal again with a political system that's reality. And so,